Okay, I'm going to hit you with some data straight away. This is a species list, and I hope you can read it. It's a bit bright in here. It's a species list based on 2 series of observations on prawn trawlers. For those of you who don't know, there's a small prawn trawling fishery just up the coast from Durban, about 100 kilometres up from Durban. So from 89 to 92, there was a whole, these are just sharks and rays, so excluding everything else. And we're looking at a species list. So in the 89 to 92 period, we're getting a predominance of this animal, scalloped hammerhead, and butterfly rays. There's a whole string of other species as well. And then we managed to get some observer data probably in the region of 10, 13 years later. And you can see there's quite a marked change in the relative abundance or proportions of these 2 species in particular. So they've both gone up markedly. So the question was, why is this? How did this situation come about? Okay, so having a look at this data, the questions were, has there been a change in the community? And there was a reason for asking this question, that the trawling effort declined substantially in this period for various reasons. So has there been a change in the community associated with this decline in trawling effort? And are these apparent changes in relative abundance a real phenomenon? In other words, on the surface of it, you would say, yes, they've increased in abundance. Is this really the case? And there's other species, other fisheries that catch these animals on our coast as well. So were we seeing these changes in those other fisheries at the same time? And then can we ascribe these changes to changes in this, or this reduction in trawling effort that I've mentioned? Okay, so very briefly, the trawling industry. So it's a small fishery. They've been operating for the last 40 years or so, probably in the region of 3 to 4 vessels. I think I'll give a little bit of detail after these pictures. This is the butterfly ray. You can see they reach a reasonably large size, sort of maybe 50 kilograms or so. Just some facts about the prawn trawling. So they've been going since the 70s, 4 vessels operating at a time, maximally. Small grounds in the region of 500 kilometers squared. They're operating down to about 45 meters of depth, trawling at a fairly slow speed of 2.5 knots. They operate 24 hours a day. The sharks and rays are discarded. They don't really want them. Not much value to them in packing them. There's an element of survival of these animals. They don't always get killed. They're quite robust, some of them, certain species anyway. It's been a closed season in this fishery since the late 1990s, so they're only allowed to trawl in certain months of the year. And as I mentioned, there's been a considerable decline in effort in this fishery, largely due to the St. Lucia system being closed and a lack of prawn recruitment. Also, the importation of farm prawns means it's just less viable for these trawlers to operate in the shallow water. So there's been a marked decline in effort, which we'll see just now. The other fishery I was interested in is the gillnet fishery, or the shark sport guys. So you can see a whole bunch of beaches along the coast of KZN where the shark nets were employed. Basically, they're just large gill nets. And they've also been operating for some years. Okay, so they've been operating since the 50s. They've got a 50 centimetre size mesh, about 400 metres offshore, and they're operating at a depth of about 12 metres of water. And they're fishing fairly continuously. Live animals are released. Okay, and then the other fishery that's also been operating for a considerable length of time is the recreational shore fishing community. And in this particular case, it's a set of data from competition shore fishermen. They go out and they fish on a fairly regular basis. There are some facts about this just now. You can see they're targeting these butterfly rays because they enjoy the strenuous nature of the exertion, I suppose, that they're exposed to when they're fighting them. And they also catch scalloped hammerheads in reasonable numbers as well. So it's a set of data from them, which I'll show you just now. So they got some records from the 1970s or so. They fish quite hard. They're out there for several thousand outings a year along the KZN coast. They tend to release their sharks increasingly these days, with the sharks and their rays. And sharks and rays give them more points. It's a competition, so they like to target these animals. Okay, so the area of interest, this is Durban, obviously, and then about 100 kilometres up the coast, you've got the Tugela River, little town of Simkwazi. in Richards Bay, probably about another 80 kilometres north of that. These are the trawl grounds here. As I mentioned, sort of less than 50 metres of depth. Quite an unusual shape, or an irregular shape, because they're very closely tied into the mud banks. So that's where the trawl data came from. The gill nets, the shark gill nets, they've got an installation in Richards Bay, and it's in Kwazi. And then the shore angling competition guys, we selected a subset of their data from this region of the coast here. So we're fairly focused on this particular region of the coast to see what was going on with these two species in particular. I'll go through this a little bit quicker. Okay, so there's a multivariate analysis. I think I'll try and go back to that. But so it's a multivariate analysis of the species themselves, the whole range, the suite of species, just to see if there's any changes. And then we also looked at some general linear regressions of the change in abundance of these two species in particular. And I confined it to the period March to July because of the closed season that was instituted in the early 2000s. So basically the trawl is only allowed to fish for 6 months of the year, and it's mainly from March to July. So I've confined the data to that period. And then similarly with the gill net catches, it was also over this period from the late 1980s to 2012. So basically that's just the approach to the data. And then similarly with the shore angling, so we were looking at the same sort of factors, years and months in the analysis. Okay, so these are nominal data. In other words, we haven't adjusted them for anything. These are pure numbers. So if you look on the left, trawl hours in the 80s and 90s, there was about 31,000 trawl hours in the 80s to 90s. In this period, 13 years later, you can see that effort has dropped by tenfold. So 10 times less trawling going on in this period than there was initially. The gill net installations and kilometres of net also declined substantially in that time, and these are angling hours by the competition shore anglers. If you look at the relative catches, so these are other numbers that were counted or estimated. So on the surface of it, the trawl fishery is catching substantially more of hammerhead sharks and butterfly rays than the other two sectors. Given that there was a tenfold reduction in trawling effort from this period to this, there was not a tenfold reduction in catch. Okay, so not as straightforward as catch and effort. Similarly with the butterfly rays, it declined by perhaps a factor of 3 or a third over the period, and yet the trawling effort dropped tenfold. All right, so on the surface of it anyway, the trawlers are certainly catching far more of these animals than the other two sectors. They're also catching slightly different sized animals. So you'll see the shark sport guys are catching larger animals for the hammerhead sharks, whereas the trawl fisher and the shore guys are catching very small animals, around about this size. So they're basically newly born hammerhead sharks. And the butterfly rays, again, the trawl guys are catching fairly small animals, maybe 70 centimetres in width, whereas the shark sport guys are catching more medium-sized animals up to 1.3 metres disc width, and the shore angling guys are catching the adults. Okay, so were there any changes in the community over this period of 13 years or so? And these are trawl catches. So if we look at the number of species of sharks and rays caught per trawl in the 1990s versus the 2000s, there certainly seems to be a little bit more in the way of numbers of species caught. So an increase in diversity of trawled sharks and rays over this period. And if you look at the densities as well, again, there seems to be more sharks and rays around, density-wise over the period. So some indication of a recovery, perhaps. The multivariate analysis, in other words, looking at the community composition of all the sharks and rays, indicates that there perhaps was some change over the time. So 1990s are the green triangles, and the 2000 period of the blue triangle, so there seems to be some sort of separation over time, indicating that there's been changes in the relative abundance of the community. Day and night differences, not too much. Shallow and deep, also not too much of a differentiation on the trawl catches. If you look at season, though, there is some indication that there's a difference between warm and cool season. So it's not really, it's not as simple as the the amount of fishing or the trawling that's taken place. There's also some seasonal effects. Okay, without trying to confuse you too much, linear modeling tries to account for a whole range of explanatory factors in, for example, change in abundance over time. I have to stand over here because otherwise I won't see the left-hand side. It's all left. So all these factors on the left here, period refers to the initial period from the 1990s to the 2000s, so that was perhaps an explanatory factor in any changes in abundance. The year was a factor, potentially month, we looked at depth, day, night, the type of vessel that was used, the actual locality that the trawl was put down or the fishing took place in. We looked at the extent or the duration of the trawls, and we looked at sea surface temperature. So what is this saying for the scalloped hammerhead? It is saying that the factors in yellow were actually far more important in explaining changes in relative abundance over time. So if you're expecting a decline in trawling effort to be an explanatory factor, then these numbers here should have been much higher in explaining the deviance observed. But in fact, month was actually much more of a significant factor in explaining scalloped hammerhead changes in relative abundance for the trawl fishery, for the gillnet fishery, and to a lesser extent for the shore fishery. Basically, year and month were both more significant in explaining those changes in relative abundance than the actual period itself. Similarly with the butterfly ray. So again here, month is a very significant factor in explaining what you're seeing for the butterfly ray relative abundance. Not so much the period. And again here for the butterfly ray, for the gillnet catches, year is incredibly important, and it'll become a little bit more apparent when I show you the plot shortly. All right, we'll take a little bit of while. How am I doing for time here, Ken?
No, good.
15 minutes.
30 seconds.
All right, I don't think we'll be able to get out of the way very well. Okay, so what we've got here, hammerheads at the top, butterfly rays at the bottom. I'm actually going to put this thing.
Sean, if you bring it in, if you give us some more room if you take it from around this table.
I'll just talk about it, fine. Okay, so the green shows the decline in trawling effort over time. It's the same on both because we're using the same trawling effort. So in the 80s and 90s, in the region of 110,000 trawl hours per year. And you can see there's a big drop there and increased a little bit. And now look at it now. Okay, it's virtually disappeared. There's virtually no trawling taking place here. These are the catch rates of the hammerhead sharks in blue over here, initially in the 80s and 90s, in the trawl grounds. Look at them here. Okay, so these are general linear model plots. So these are adjusted for all the explanatory factors which I've mentioned. So catch rates on the trawl grounds of hammerhead sharks have gone up a lot. Maybe you predict that because the trawling effort has declined substantially. Let's have a look at the shark sport catches. This is, for you, it's probably blue. This blue line here. So it's overlaid on this. So the gillnet catches of hammerhead sharks, low in the 90s, a bit of a spike here. You might think, oh, trawling effort's gone down, gillnet catches go up. That makes sense. But look over here. Okay, there's a lot of bouncing up and down of these gillnet catches of hammerhead sharks. And it's not a clear relationship with the decline in trawling effort. Similarly, with the shore angling catches of hammerhead sharks, very low over this period of year. Suddenly there's a huge spike over here, and then it whoops back straight down again. And as I mentioned, year and month are far more important in explaining these sorts of phenomena than simply saying low trawling here or high trawling effort here, low trawling here. This is explaining it. Similarly with the butterfly array. So there's the trawl effort declining initially, and go again, and then decline to virtually zero these days. The catches of these animals is all over the show. Sometimes it picks up, goes down, up and down. There's really no strong pattern there, certainly not an association directly with trawl effort. And to an extent, this is reflected by the gillnet fishery as well. All right, so what does all that mean? So there seems to have been some changes in the community over the sort of 15-year period on the trawl ground. So the different, what was that? Is that a sign? Ah, okay, I was expecting it there. Okay, so there's been some changes in the community. The multivariate work does need a little bit more analysis. This is still reasonably early days for that component of it. There's certainly been a decline in these animals from the 1990s to the 2000s. I mean, a reduction in trawling, I should say, and there seems to have been a recovery of them on the trawl grounds themselves. But it's not as clear from the catches of the gillnet fishery or the shore angling fishery that there's been a release, if you like. So this decline in effort from the trawling has not resulted in a release of these animals or a recovery, if you like, in the other two sectors, fisheries. It is slightly complicated by the fact that they're catching different sized animals. So as I said, the trawl fishery is catching some neonates, they're just newly born. The gillnet fishery is catching them at a slightly larger stage. In the case of the hammerheads, in the shore fishing sector, again, they're catching the adults. So there's a bit of a lag you might expect. And that hasn't been taken into account by the general linear modelling. So overall, we can conclude that there's no effect of this reduction in trawling has been demonstrated for the gillnet and the angling sectors. So month and year are far more stronger explanatory factors. Okay, so what does this all mean for sampling in future? We were reliant on observer data. Okay, so we don't have the luxury of a research trawler to go out there and go and do our own sampling. We're relying on commercial fishing. So fisheries dependent sampling, you're dependent on fishermen, has got lots of benefit. It's cheaper and so forth, but you've got very little control over when and where your sampling takes place. And they don't always these data don't always lend themselves to rigorous analysis, and so life is not simple, basically. And notwithstanding the 6-month closed season, or the trawl closed season that's in place, and the almost complete absence of trawling currently, as you can see, there's evidence from this and other studies that these trawl grounds are unique in South Africa and warrant some protection, and efforts are underway in the form of a marine protected area in the Tugela region to have this instituted. And just some acknowledgement there. Thanks very much.